everyone. My name is Christian Matti. I'm currently working as policy analyst in the Competence Center on Foresight in the European Commission. But until February, I was working with the EIT Climate Kick as head of research. So what I'm going to present actually is a collaboration between several kicks, not only the Climate Kick and the Joint Research Center, on understanding what is creation for policy process based on experience. And the narrative that I'm going to present to you is this kind of meta-narrative about what happened in a country like, for example, Malta, Bulgaria, or Cyprus. They need to start to do that, okay? They just jump into participatory process without having an idea about where they are going to go. So how we can actually prepare the overall understanding of co-creation for policy before jumping into the concrete tools and designing the workshops and so on. And I'm going to do that as part of storytelling, but at the end, obviously, there is a handbook and there are a collection of tools that have been used in all these years of experience from all these organizations. But the idea is creating this kind of meta-narrative that help a project officer or a policy officer to understand how to approach a co-creation process for policy from a strategic point of view. And then you can go into the details. So as inspiration for us, I just decided to use a quote from Frank Giles. Maybe some of you know it. It's coming from the transition approach. He's a leader on this thought. And there is this kind of particular gap that is now the different systems at city, regional, and national level address what is called the policy mix. Okay? Especially if you have an European environment, you need to deal with the multi-level governments and multiple frameworks and multiple, the mission-oriented approach, the circular economy transition, the digital transition, what happened in the cities. What does it mean to do that in Europe in terms of the collaborations and the networks, the value chains, etc.? So the point is how you address co-creation for policy when you have to have this transformative change as the kind of the back of the process. So the point is that for us addressing transformative change, sometimes we try to be concrete and we start with a particular sector. And we can have, of course, as it was mentioned, the human factor, and from more the innovation and the industry point of view, we can have the work unit, the organization, and the industry. This is a way that we can describe the different levels of a particular subsystem. But the reality is that we have another ones on different sectors and so on. And they might be connected by, for example, in terms of mobility or energy infrastructure, but also market and finance. But also we have the policy landscape, that is what I was referring before. So all these elements is part of the understanding of how we see systems and the kind of things that we want to transform. And in order to understand how we can transform the systems, we also need to understand that all these kind of connections, okay? So this kind of mindset in terms of setting a process, identifying the resources and trying to get an outcome is very complex. And what I will try to explain, even with examples, is how you can navigate the process of setting a co-creation process, okay, without getting into the details of the participatory methods of the tools, just the overall narrative behind this process of transformation. So the first thing that we have identified from these two type of organizations, the KICs are innovation communities, and the JRC is the scientific body of the Commission that support the policymakers in the Commission to understand the future of the policies. It's the principle for co-creation, okay? So all of them might resonate to you a lot from the last discussion about the clarity of scope and purpose. But in the case of the co-creation for policy, it's not the simple clarity and purpose about we want to generate a change. We might want to develop a strategy or an implementation plan. There is a level of concreteness about the co-creation for policy that is different from open type of co-creation processes. You are putting people together because you want to achieve something in a particular domain. And as part of that, it's very important the focus on outcome and transparency. What I'm going to have out of this process. And a particular answer can be a prototype of a capacity building for SMEs on circular economy. Because I'm co-creating a policy instrument. This is co-creation for policy, okay? I need to generate something. And this is something that in a normal participatory process for system innovation is super open, okay? But when there is a policy behind, in order to generate credibility, you need to be clear about the potential outcome, the level of concreteness, inclusiveness and representativeness. In the last session, I mentioned something about learning, and I think it was connected to a question from someone that is here. Her question was about learning, and I bring this issue about experimentation and how you generate spaces for learning and move forward. But in order to bring that explanation, I brought the element about risk. And this is very common in the discussion on circular economy, for example, in Brussels and several European organizations. It's not just about being open and bring everyone for being inclusive. It's about the risk and not about not having the right people in the room for the implementation phase. If you do not design in the right way, you can fail big time in the implementation. And this is part of the co-creation process, how you mitigate the failures in implementation because you really want to achieve change, okay? So the discussions are very much about how we get there, okay? Because there are resources involved. Then we have high quality tailored process. Why? And we will see later on about the actionable knowledge. We need to harvest every single discussion and piece of information and transform that in inputs for a prototype or for an intervention or for an action. So something that I used to say in the past that I think I should avoid to say right now in my new position is that we should avoid this festival of post-its that are thrown in the bin at the end. I mean, there is a kind of a maturity on design thinking after 10 years. And especially for policy process, we need to see how other type of practices needs to be considered in order to move forward in the process of sustaining systemic change. So when I mention quality tailored process, high quality tailored process, I'm very much talking about how we really appreciate the time, the ideas, and every single piece of information, and we transform that in something that is meaningful for having a smarter conversation after any single intervention. That could be a workshop, a meeting, a mapping process with a tool, anything. We really need to take care of all that information and make it flow. Finally, the systemic perspective, that is what I explained before, okay? Like considering different angles to understand how this kind of policy can affect. So how we do that, I'm just going to refer briefly about that. So obviously there is a sense-making element about understanding how these principles and the outcome of the policy process relate to different participants. And because of there is an outcome and there is a purpose, it should be challenge-led, okay? So the point is that there is a knowledge creation here. We are prototyping something. There is a potential tool, instrument, program, action. So the recognition that you are creating something is very important because there is a policy officer there are funding resources there, and there is a potential of this becoming something that is more instrumental in the future. Last but not least, you are making decisions over the process. And please do not think in a workshop. This is a process that can last months or even years. You are taking decisions from one prototype to priorities, to agreements, and so on. And then you generate tangible and intangible outcomes. If you develop a prototype and an intervention, you have a tangible outcomes. But what happened with the networks and the relations and the trust that you generated all over the process, okay? So all these principles apply all over the process, okay? So this is actually indeed the chapter 2 of the handbook. An example, you were showing a map. So this was an experience that is currently running that we start in the Western Balkans. So 6 countries in the Western Balkans, including Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, and Montenegro. So what we applied is a kind of a system mapping approach to move to the logic of innovation portfolios. What you see there are real projects and stakeholders in all these areas, from general circular economy to waste, manufacturing, raw materials, finance, digital mobility. The process of getting there was from February to June, and from June to September, there was a kind of multilateral conversation, including the OECD, the World Bank, and their ongoing process. But for doing this, we involved 6 CICs, not one CIC. There were 6 partners, one in each country running this in their own language. And that involves one mentoring session per week over 6 months. There's no workshop here, okay? So it's a kind of a process of transfer, and they create their own maps, as you can see, to supporting scientific organization, and they were able to map almost 712 actors on all these projects and all these type of relations. They run their own co-creation workshops about what intervention, because this is the aggregated map for the Western Balkan, but as you can see, there are individuals more simple. What are the intervention points that can be attractive for the future for stimulate the circular economy? And they run that in their own language with their own stakeholders and policymakers. And they involve 129 regional stakeholders. And there was this kind of multilateral discussion. Why? Because one of the lessons learned here is that the portfolios in these countries, because they are kind of in an enlargement of European Union, they have funding from UN, from the World Bank. So there are multiple funding and multiple portfolios, and being systemic means you need to intermediate between these different fundings and create initiatives that are attractive for all of them. But this is a co-creation process that goes far beyond a project or a participatory process. And as you can see, the principles are kind of a little bit reflected in the list of bullet points that I'm bringing here. But let's talk a little bit more on the process. So what we identify is that we need to consider some kind of parameters to help people to understand how to design and go through the process. So there are elements that are related to the preparation, the before, the type of decision making that I want to have in this co-creation process. Could be very simple information and consultation, or it could be more empowerment and co-creation and getting an outcome. Not every co-creation process needs to have a super sophisticated program or intervention at the end. So there is this kind of range, okay? And the same for the flexibility of the process. Depending on the type of discussion that you want to have, it could be completely different. An example from a policy from the European Commission, some of you may know about the smart specialization strategy. For many years, this kind of strategy was a kind of an instrument to allocate funding in the region for 7 years. So that is a different type of instrument comparing to, for example, the Covenant of Mayors, okay? That is involved more citizens and is more about citizen initiatives. The same in terms of the level of decision making that is connected to all of this. That is the setting of the co-creation. And depending on that, you can start working in how you are going to do that. The duration can be not just a workshop or 1 day or 2 days, that this is an example here, can be months because include the executive meetings, include the exchange of information. And depending on what you want, as I mentioned before, the outcome oriented, the duration can be completely different. And you need to be aware of that because this is about commitment and engagement of all the actors. Then we have here the logic of use of a space. When we mention reaching participatory process and flexible participatory process, we are not just mentioning what happened in a room. It's also what can happen in Google Drive, okay? Or in Teams, or in whatever, in terms of, can we co-edit the documents? Do we have tools like the web she presented before that everybody can edit and present? That is part of the use of space. It's kind of a space in also the cognitive space and also the physical space, okay? It depends now in a very digitalized mode. We need to understand that the space is also a document, okay? How we co-create there. Finally, we have this issue about self-organizing principles and or very directive type of facilitation. And this goes beyond the process and also touch very particular issues about the innovation ecosystem. What about leadership? It's not the same running this in a city, a region, or or at ministerial level, but also in different countries and cultural conditions. The facilitation or the leaders of the process could be the university, an agency of the government, or a social organization, depending on the topic and so on. So depending on the capacity of facilitation and the context, it can range in a different way, okay? Finally, we have what we call the after. That is, more than the after, is about the kind of the strategic after, okay? Involvement of a stakeholder over time. One event, one single occasion, or multiple times. The knowledge management and communication, what I was referring before, are we going to create every single piece of information? Do we need to do that? Because it's an input for the next conversation. It's very important because that means that there is going to be implications in the team, and you will see more about the team later on. And of course, the impact for policymaking. It means like what type of output we need to develop in order to have an impact in this particular part of the process of policymaking. We call it the tuner, okay? For the ones that are kind of my age, they understand what means the tuner, that is from the kind of the old music systems that you just adjust. But that's the logic. Depending on the multiple settings, you adjust everything. This is the type of narrative that we want to bring in the handbook, okay? Before jumping into a participatory process and use a particular tool, just make a reflection where you want to go, and just take a look about the different dimensions about the policy process. An example, this is a collaboration supported by EU raw materials between Europe and Africa. So we were looking at a vision and roadmap on road materials. As you can imagine, with the circular economy, it's a conflictive element, okay, about the relations between Europe and Africa. So there was an issue about the different programs and capacity of the kits and the demand perspective in terms of the particular sectors, and trying to have what we call a service delivery mode, about more the technical assistant type of logic, okay? So as part of that, a vision and a roadmap was co-created from a challenge-led system approach, how it looks like. There were concrete tools. You remember the choice of methods at the beginning, depending on what you want, but also co-creation workshop in Brussels and in South Africa from July to December. 11 partners from 5 European countries supporting this collaboration. These kind of things were not happening spontaneously, were planned because there were all these kind of elements planned in advance in order to generate this kind of technical roadmap that is going to support the collaboration between Africa and the European Union. So we talk about the teams and the responsibilities of knowledge management. So this is what we can consider even a complete team for delivering a co-creation and policy process. So you have what we call the workshop or project convener, the one that is actually like bringing the project or the initiative. It is at city level, regional level, the one that is responsible, or the one that mobilizes of the people. But around that, we focus all the time on the facilitator. But what about the workshop assistant that makes all happen? Or what about the knowledge curator, that what I mentioned before, the person that is going to harvest and take notes and transform that into inputs for the next meeting? But then you have the challenge owner. So you have the technical officer or the policy officer of the city, of the region, or even it could be at national level. And that is part of the core of the team to decide what you are going to co-create. And obviously thematic expert. But then obviously when you are doing co-creation, you work with community. So you have the local community or the close community with business, civil society, or universities, the knowledge triangle, the quadruple helix. In a European context, you also have the broader community, because if you work something in Europe, it can be connected to other cities and regions and so on. And because it can be related to covenant of mayors or smart specialization, it's going to be interconnected with something else. So this is part of the design that needs to be considered in terms of the sustainability of the process over time. And I'm going to give you an example. I mentioned this in the last call about the collaboration between the European Commission and the KICS to set a conversation on low carbon economy. That was the team for running that with 42 participants for 7 countries. Just one facilitator, one program management, 2 innovation managers, 1 knowledge curator, an international expert, and 3 policy officers to run a first initiative with 42 participants from 7 countries, 13 of them policymakers, okay? When we activate this, we were expecting that something was going to happen, and actually something happened. So we use a method, we collect this information, and from that moment on, this is the first initiative out of 3, and I want to explain all of them. 9 ministries now in East Slovenia are working in the transition on circular economy, okay? And there are 5 value chains involved, 12 programs and 9 ministries. But you need to activate this with this kind of systemic approach and with this kind of logic about co-creating something. In that workshop, there was the clear intention about identifying all of these are, for example, policy instruments that were mapped and financial possibilities. The resources that are available to take action on circular economy. And from that, over the years, you can get into this. So it's not a workshop, it was years of co-creation for policy. Finally, and I'm getting there, don't worry, there will be a space for questions and comments. What I mentioned before about harvesting the information, having mapped the instruments, the actors, the relations, and make sense of that. How we consider the actionable knowledge as part of like a kind of the main, how can I say it, outcome of the full process that can be used for many different things. So I'm just going to exemplify with this figure. Sensemaking could be in this context of co-creation in a transformative change, a type of conversation that helps to understand footloose conversation that can be there on climate, on energy, on industry and social innovation, and anchor that as part of a transformative concept. For example, system innovation or a smart specialization that is another systemic concept that it was used in the Commission for several years. So anchoring that into something concrete can be done through Sensemaking. What does it make sense in terms of combining this and that? What are the synergies? What are the complementarities? Part of that is just the Sensemaking and the learning in terms of the systemic aspect, how we move forward in terms of co-creation. So the point is knowledge co-creation needs to be related to prototyping something and moving forward with an initiative. So we have policy areas, policy instruments, programs, projects, and actors. You really need to move into the intervention mode for co-creating something. Co-creation in a policy process cannot be just a map. It needs to be an intervention, move forward. And as part of that, you need to take decisions about how this prototype makes sense in your complex process. If it's a city, how this connects with the region. If it's a region, how to connect with other regions or with the national step. So you have the multi-level governance, but you have the policy mix. If it's a climate strategy, how do you relate with the circular economy goals? Or if it's something connected to citizen engagement, how it goes with the kind of the future of democracy in your country. So this is the type of process where the knowledge flows because you have a purpose to creating something meaningful as part of a bigger picture. But in order to do that, and this is chapter 5, you need to understand how the inputs of every single aspect of the co-creation process is an output for a smarter conversation later on. And that's facilitate the maturity of the co-creation process because you are feeding with these insights kind of a smarter conversations. So this is the last example. We applied with Bulgaria there in 2019 in Slovenia with the other countries. These particular methods on value network mapping to understand how they can transform their smarter specialization strategy into a circular smart specialization strategy. For the ones that are not familiar with the smart specialization, is the regional strategy to be more industrialized in the more, how can I say, the strength areas of the regions, okay? If you are good in digital and you are good in agricultural thing, well, let's specialize in biotech, okay? Like combining the strengths and get specialized in something concrete. So we try to help the country to think about how to use the strengths to move into circular economy, okay? And we use this particular method with 3 different areas, with startups, with recycling companies at city level, and with different clusters, okay? There was a pharmaceutical cluster, biochemical cluster, etc. And through this facilitation with Sensemaking and knowledge creation, this is something that, let me see if, because this was during COVID. So the participants were able to have a discussion about how the different interconnected elements of the systems make sense from a circular point of view. But there were ministries there, and as I mentioned, this is the cluster on startups. That was the discussion on startups, and there were several of that. But as you can see, they are mapping at the same time. And look at this, plan actions, weakness and opportunities. So you combine the status quo of the system with the relations between the actors, because these are transactions of money and flows in a conversation with policymakers. So the point is that now that you create an awareness and a sense making about how the system works, how you move forward with the interventions. So the tool in that case have that purpose to generate opportunities for design interventions to move into a circular economy. And the result of that, was digitalized and was a tool for having conversation with the ministries, between the companies, the municipalities, so how they can move forward, okay? So in these 3 workshops, there was 230 entries, and we harvest every single element from the conversations. And this is also very useful in terms of community engagement. This is the handbook, okay? You can download the handbook from the website of the European Commission. You see now that my story was very much that: principle, process, team, actionable knowledge, and example. That is the structure of the handbook. I co-edited the handbook with Gabriel Risola from the Joint Research Center. I started the handbook when I was in Climate Kick. Now I'm in the other side. And as you can see here, you have Climate Kick, Joint Research Center, facilitation. I mean, the experience of facilitations is super important. Another kick, another kick, another kick. So there was raw materials, climate, energy, different perspective on transformation. But also we have other contributors from different spaces. This is a collection of experience over years and years of working. And we are also suggesting in the tool other publications. So as you can see here, this is a handbook on participatory methods for innovation. The innovation comes, it's managing complexity about system perspective. This is from Climate Kick, tools for system thinking, for system mapping, for sense making, and for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. All of these elements of handbooks were created based on experience in the same way, but these are this kind of more granular level about the workshop or the participatory process. What we are trying to achieve with this handbook, is to say, well, before getting dirty in the methods and the tools and so on, how we try to understand the strategic logic of co-creating in a policy process. How we can be more strategic in understanding the type of decisions and elements that we need to consider to make it happen, and not having another participatory workshop. And we can overcome the workshop logic and think about the level of investment that we need to do to get something out of that. And that's why we have a pure chapter on actionable knowledge. That brings this idea about prototyping interventions and moving forward with decision making. So that's my presentation. And I think we have around 25 minutes for questions. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So what I'm interested is in, okay, we use CoCreation for policy, but do we need this to do this on like this very high level? I'm questioning, maybe you're not in the position to comment on that, but do we need more handbooks or do we need more actionable things that are getting done on the ground? And it's still difficult for me.
It's a very good question, because the point is, what do you do with the handbook? Okay, so one of the, and I'm going to go back to this. This handbook, just to give you an example, was edited in 2016. Okay, now it's used in secondary schools, and it was supposed to be for entrepreneurs. So the point is, what is the people behind the handbook is doing with that? Because it's similar to every single report. Okay, so you have knowledge there, and then how you use that knowledge. In some way, you need to get to materialize the knowledge in something that could be instrumental. The handbook is just an instrument. The driving factor for the co-creation process is the people that use that or promote that in a process. So this is just an instrument. Actually, if you do not have in a workshop, it's the same that I said, if you do not have a knowledge management after the workshop, you just have people talking, okay? And you create a cognitive super powerful element, but all the information that was there can be lost if you do not do anything else, okay? So in this case, the handbook is just an instrument for people that could use some ideas to drive something, but also especially for all these organizations that are behind, to promote a type of good practices. Just if you read the handbook, you will see that one of the core elements of from the KIC perspective is a program called Regional Innovation Scheme. There are 14 countries there. We have used these practices in 14 countries, okay? So the people that are there are going to use this handbook to do that by themselves, because it's the same that we have done with this, and with this, and with all of this. These are just consolidation of the way we work. It's not, the handbook is just a publication. The point is the practice that is behind.
Maybe I didn't phrase the question right. Basically, should we focus on the output in this, you know, area when, you know, like, how do you analyze the rest of who is sitting in the room, who is getting invited into those conversations? Because you're right in saying, yes, we have this sort of, you know, European approach, and we have to do this more often. But is it, how do we transfer that knowledge that you inquired more into universities, more broad?
Yeah.
Because it's great being here in this room, but it's like a very limited number of us.
I see. Are you familiar with the KICs?
Yes.
Okay, so you know that the role of the KICs doing that.
Yeah.
So probably the answer is there. We have 3 KICs involved here that are applying this in professional education, but also in innovation projects. So we are doing this kind of tools and methods because it's the inputs for them to get dirty with practitioners and with universities and students. These are part of capacity building and technical assistance to cities, professionals, and so on, the same that one. And was part of a training on monitoring, evaluation, and learning for several organizations, and it's going to go forward to another edition. So these are just inputs, instrumental to do other kind of things, whether if you do a co-creation process or if you develop new competence and skills. You can call it that could be learning materials as well. Yes, they are. Okay, so it's just an instrument, the handbook. You need to consolidate sometimes some lesson learned so others can use it. This is kind of the curation and the knowledge management process of the organization that are behind. Otherwise, that knowledge gets in my head or in the head of the facilitators. So that is kind of our effort. Actually, in this handbook, at the end of this handbook, we put a phrase that was like, this is our an illustrative example about our commitment to learn, to harvest, and share with the community. There were 3 years and more than 40 projects to write this handbook.
Yeah, maybe you get into aspect of awareness too, aren't you? Like, it's great to have this research and framework and all of this,
Yeah.
but how do you reach all those people? And I think there's different people doing that. For example, I shared that report there on the right,
This one.
if you remember, right? A lot of people, that's kind of what our organization systems innovation is about, kind of raising awareness and go for much larger, quite large reach, right? So there's different people doing different things.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's in the research area, right?
Yeah,
There's people
yeah,
like
yeah.
us, those people doing the awareness and so forth. So yeah, Mariana.
Many thanks. Super interesting. And I have two types of questions. One is related to what you were mentioning. The first is on the projects you have done in these countries, trying to understand from the moment you start the project towards the project impact that you mentioned, how long did it take more or less on average? And did you get the funding for the whole project at the beginning, or did you have to go by parts, kind of convincing people this is useful and then move to the next steps? And then my second question is a little bit related to the dissemination strategy of the handbook. If I understand correctly, part of the process is to mentor countries' officials so that they are able to continue doing that themselves. Do you do that as well with international organizations, for example, as part of the dissemination strategy? Organizations that could be catalysts to work with other countries.
Thank you. I need to use different hats to answer the questions, because now I'm a policy analyst at the Commission, but before I was at Climate Kick, that I was more kind of an innovation type of person. So the first question regarding the duration and the funding is going to be very different in different contexts. But because of the principles that we mentioned before, you need to guarantee that there is availability of resources and commitment of the people to get to a particular outcome. So, for example, in some of the actions, we were reviewing existing strategies, okay? So there is a kind of a policy process behind, with commitment from the policymakers, but also from industry and organizations that want to be part of this strategy, okay? So there is a kind of a multi-funding scheme, because you can combine, for example, the funding related to public funding with funding from other projects that are interested in that strategy, because it's going to change the overall logic. So it's a kind of a multi-funding logic, and the duration depends very much on the type of outcome that you want to have, and the level of commitment. So you measure that at the beginning, and you set the co-creation process some expectations that are kind of easy to achieve in terms of a particular action. But to wrap up, it's multi-funding, okay? And duration depends very much on the different type of outcomes and milestones that you want to do. Going to the dissemination, yes, this is public good. I mean, it's funded by the European Commission. It's going to be available. We have already done several webinars that are recorded and online. For a concrete program that you may know, for the ones that comes from the European sphere, there is a Science Meet Regions program that is about promoting co-creation between universities and governments. We are going to do a training on this for this program, and the idea is moving forward with this kind of activities as part of the Competence Center of Foresight, because it's part of the concept that is the European Policy Lab on bringing this competence to others in different formats. So yeah, probably we can discuss about that. Yeah. Yes, please.
I have a couple of questions. One is you talked about the ideas that come up and capturing all of them and so forth, and I can imagine all of those lead to policy changes. And I'm curious about what happens with those ideas. And the second is I would love to understand, and it might be too granular for this presentation, and I understand what it is, but thinking about the policy prototyping, and maybe one of your favorite examples. So something that went through a prototype process, what that actually looked like, and what came out the other side.
Regarding the first question, I think you get there into the very methodological aspects about how you co-create. Okay, we are not covering that in the in the handbook. Sorry, in this one. This is covered in all these ones. What you get out of applying one method or one particular tool and so on. What I can tell you is from experience about applying different tools is that as part of what I mentioned before about the sense making, you do agenda and priority setting, okay? And what we always ask is to have the individual inputs, and then we clusterize and we do affinity maps as part of any kind of exercise. So you have this kind of level of granularity, and then as part of that, you facilitate conversations about the alignment. Because one of the particular aspects on co-creation for policy when you have multiple stakeholders is you need to negotiate meaning. You asked for an example. I was in Malta several years ago, and it was a discussion at Malta level that is not very big. And after a while, the people from Malta government said, well, we appreciate what you are doing here, but because we tried to talk with the university several times and try to understand how we can work together. And now I realize that we wanted to talk about green public procurement, but we were using different terminology. So when you use knowledge management over the process, during the process and after the process, you can see this kind of granularity that creates some affinity in terms of some priorities or some interventions that allow you to move forward, okay? So we try to apply that in all the tools that we have or the methods, and this is kind of not only coming from KICS, but also from the JRC about trying to understand the different perspectives and the values. There is actually a competence center in the Commission dealing with the identities and values and the problems on democracy about understanding this kind of difference. And I think this is an important part of the process, is trying to understand how you create this kind of affinities and alignments as part of this different in terms of language and values. And the second question was about?
I was wondering about a specific example of a
Yeah.
policy that emerged from a process that you were involved in.
Maybe it's the kind of the biggest one, but I think it's the most clear. So when we did this kind of workshop in Slovenia, they realized that in order to move into this transformative change for circular economy, they needed an experimental space, because they were working too much in silos. And for the ones that are more familiar with the policy in the European Union, with, for example, the cohesion policy, for many years, the funding was allocated to specific priorities that in the countries was as in silos, okay? So the Ministry of Finance just distribute the money, but then you have the money for agriculture, for energy, et cetera, et cetera. Circular economy is a big challenge on that, because you need to, if you take it transformative, you need to take even education and so on. But how you create an experimental space to think in a different way. So the result of that over the years, and I think I mentioned that during the panel, it was first one ministry, then 3 ministries, finally 9 ministries, and 12 programs, completely interconnected to facilitate the transition on circular economy in Slovenia. And with the support of the Commission, the KICS, and the value change. It took a couple of years to get there, okay? But it works, now it's working. Have more time for question, I think, no? Yes.
In terms of language barriers, right? Obviously, each European country speaks a different language. Locally, were these, from the examples that you've given us, were these run by the government, by the local government, by what kind of agencies locally did you use, and how did that research process, were you overseeing it? How does that work with you?
It's a good question, but I do not have a single answer. So what I can have is an example, okay, that I actually show. You may remember the first example was on the Western Balkans, okay? And it was 6 countries and 6 KICS and so on. So it was a kind of a complex process. But locally, there was an organization in Kosovo one in North Macedonia, one in Serbia, running all the activities in their own language. Okay, obviously that organization speaks in English with us and translate that to the meta level, that is the kind of the regional level. But that is why it's important to have this. We have a chapter 4 on the community aspect and the team aspect, the interface about how you make it happen to work with the challenge owner or the facilitator or the workshop convener in this case, okay, is the project convener that facilitates the discussion with the community. So in the case of the KICs in general, I can quote again, there is this kind of risk programs with 14 countries that enable local organizations to run their activities on their own language. And in the European Commission in general, I'm just new, but I know that they make a lot of efforts to translate and to communicate in several languages to reach as much countries as they can. Yeah.
Specifically, locally, what kind of organizations do you have?
That is another question that I can answer in different way.
Off the top of my head, is it I don't know, is it a local kind of government? Do you have like external agencies coming in? Do you have research agencies? Universities? I don't know, like.
It's a good question, and it could be all of them.
Oh, it could be all of them.
Because depends on the local ecosystem, okay? And this is something that I think I also mentioned in the other two about leadership. Depending also the topic. If it's about having a more egalitarian region, maybe the main actor is an NGO, okay? If it's about, actually one in circular economy, one of the actors was the chambers of commerce, one of them was in the university, one of them was a kind of innovation startup, SME. So depending on the ecosystem and the type of discussion, it can change completely. I use also the example of the Basque Country and how they are like a kind of an example of a good relation between university, industry, and government. But what about when we have discussions with them, what about the social aspects? You need to define all the level of leaderships in the system that can run this process, because they have the kind of the assets, the knowledge of the system, and also the access to the different stakeholders. So depending on the topic and the ecosystem could be different. And this is a little bit magical of the process when you have several regions working together, because you see the variety of factors bringing different insights to this meta discussion about the collaboration.
That must build upon the things because they have those networks.
Yeah. Exactly, and all the KICs works in exactly the same way.
That was just like my professional question was like, do you have like a network that you reach out? Because when we do research around the world, we have like local teams that do that.
Yeah, so I'm not in Climate Kick anymore, but right now I think they have 400 partners in 28 countries, but each kick has exactly the same. So, and this was developed over 10 years. So there is a maturity in the relations, so they know the ecosystems. And so that's why we want to catalyze or even materialize the lesson over the years on working in this way, so we can feed the process for future process.
And you emphasize knowledge management, and you said a little bit about what that looks like. I know it's not your job, but generally, what does that look like? Creating taxonomies and stuff, or like databases or categorizations, or how does that work?
Well, the level of effort that you put on ontologies or tagging exercise depends on what you need out of that. Because the simple answer is that you need to harvest information and structure the data just to have a better conversation after that. Okay, it's not about having the perfect map. Yeah, but it's about creating an input for a smarter conversation after that you have done anything, a conversation, a mapping, or whatever, okay? So you might need to embrace the complexity with some tagging exercise or some ontology. In the past, what I can say is that these ontologies come from a kind of a grounded theory. So you use it's a long-term process about using the right wording so everybody can understand what you are trying to say. Okay, and it's the same in terms of the different elements of the system. In one of these books, we have actually in this one an ontology and system innovation about what you can think about system innovation. Okay, actions, barriers, resources, and kind of different elements that you can use. And the facilitator can take that and start to think about how to frame the discussions, because those elements are already curated and are very easy to manage in a conversation. So there's no a perfect taxonomy or ontology or whatever, but as much as you work on that with the community, that's why it's important, this connection with the technical officer in the city, in the region, of whatever, what they understand out of the process, not just the facilitator or the technician managing the post-its and the data set. It's just like a kind of a feedback loop that is a constant. And one particular issue is that how you overcome the text element and you use kind of visual metaphors about that, okay? So in terms of like visualizing even the proportions of the elements, because it's not about the specific element, but also if you have interventions or if you have actors, how much important are NGOs here, okay? Doesn't matter the granularity of the data. It's about that you are counting how many elements was in the discussions. And I say, well, this is not the truth of the map. It's the discussion that we have last week or 2 weeks ago. Is this true? How we can move forward? Do you think that the NGOs are underrepresented in this discussion? Should we? And that is knowledge management. Yeah. It's not text. It's like collecting elements and trying to see also the logic of the system somehow and represented and being represented in a visual way to have a smarter conversation. So not always is about text. Sometimes it's more about the relations of the components, because the tools allow you to play with that. Okay, it's kind of more playful.
Yeah, and then it informs the policy that comes out of it, right? That's built on that language.
Yeah.
Great. Should we take over the one more?
Well, I have a question, I think, about scale. So you work at the European level, right? And many times there's also policy pushed by government, and then when you try to keep like this local level, right, where things need to be implemented somehow. How does that work? Do you have any experience on kind of barriers or enablers to kind of that change to actually happen, you know, in the ground? We've seen that many times governments or, you know, the European Union can be very innovative or, you know, able to propose these policies, but then what happens with the capabilities to actually, you know, kind of implement this change?
Yeah. I do have 2 minutes. I'm new in the European Commission, but I will try to answer as much as I can, okay? So it's very difficult sometimes to overcome the concept that the European Commission is just a big body that is kind of more into policies and regulation and so on. But one concrete example that can help you to answer that are the KICs, okay? The KICs are funded by the European Institute of Innovation and Technology and provide funding to communities, to cities, to regions, to companies, to universities to work as a community to do that change, okay? But there is this kind of agency body that get connected with the territory, okay? A new body that was created, I think, a couple of years ago is the European Innovation Council, and work with SMEs and startups and investment and so on. And there are agencies like CINEA that works with projects on climate change, infrastructure, and mobility. So you have this kind of agency level that are more in contact with the kind of the granularity of the value change and the actors. And I guess I'm missing a lot of other programs, like the ones connected to the Covenant of Mayors and the citizen participation for the Climate Pact and so on. So there is this kind of programmatic level in the implementation aspect that there is a huge investment there in order to articulate the actions with the actors. But that is from the European Commission as an institution element. From the European policy, the funding is provided in a way like through the Horizon programs or through the cohesion policy to the regions and the cities to work and create their own strategies and actions by themselves with the support of all these agencies. So there is this kind of logic about territorial aspect, but also like